Good morning. If you have your New Testaments, be opening up to John chapter 9. John chapter 9 is where we'll be taking our Bible study from this morning. Brother Michael Ryan will lead us in an opening prayer, and then we'll begin our study together. So this morning we're looking at lesson number 6, a reminder, lesson number 5. Next week is lesson number 6, and then the following, all right, so John chapter 9. Someone briefly try to remind us of where we are in the Gospel of John and what has been happening in John 7 and 8 that leads to 9 and 10. John chapter 7, Jesus comes to Jerusalem for what feast? Feast of Booths. He doesn't come in like he did in the triumphant entry, but rather he comes in privately, right? Well, when he comes in to the Feast of Booths, toward the middle of the week, and then especially the last day of the feast, Jesus begins to do what? In the temple itself. He begins to teach. When Jesus begins to teach, how do the Jews respond to Jesus' teaching, both in 7 and 8? They reject him, and they want to arrest him in chapter 7 and chapter 8. They pick up the stones. They want Jesus dead. So then now Jesus is leaving the temple. It seems that Jesus is leaving the temple in chapter 9. And really, and this is something that I didn't really capture until a few years ago, and just reading and studying through the Gospel of John and then teaching through it, is that John 7, 8, 9, 10 through 21 is all essentially just 1 week. It's all just really one day, essentially, is everything that's transpiring. But when we come to John chapter 9, who becomes the main character of John chapter 9? The man who has been born blind. He's the main character. Jesus he kind of slips off into the background throughout the remainder of this chapter. Now, he plays a pivotal role, absolutely, but the main character is the blind man here in John chapter 9. So the first question is, well, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind? Explain. What is it that the disciples are grappling with here when they ask this question?
Neither or.
All right, so it's neither of the individuals, but what is it that they're really asking? What motivates this question? All right, who was at fault? But why do they believe that somebody is at fault or fault? All right, so bad thing equals punishment, right? If something causes you suffering, then sinfulness has to have had to occur. Well, what book in the Bible tells us that that's false? Job. The very basic principle of Job is that Job was a man of integrity. Job was a faultless man. Job was a blameless man, but yet he suffered greatly for that. So Job answers the question for us in the Old Testament, but what about here? Jesus' answer is what? Neither. Neither have sinned. Now, before we look at the final phrase of that, so that the works of God, remember, John's gospel's written in a very similar pattern. Go back to John chapter 5. Jesus heals a blind man there, right? Or Not a blind man, but a lame man. But what does Jesus tell him at the end in verse 14? Sin no more. The implication is that why was he in his situation for 38 years? Because of sin. And I think that's an interesting contrast to John chapter 9, is here you have a man who is suffering for however long. We're never told his age, but he's been suffering for however long being blind, and yet no sin has occurred to bring about that. Any other thoughts there on this first question? Can we be guilty of the same idea? Even in the 21st century, we can still be guilty of asking this same question. Because again, typically when something terrible happens to somebody, we're trying to understand the why behind it. And again, that's why I when I think about the book of Job, is the question why ever answered by God in the book of Job? Why not? He doesn't have to know. God doesn't have to explain these things. So what do we learn from all of this? What can we learn from all of these different things? From Job, from the man born blind? Okay. God sends rain on the just and the unjust, Brother Seth?
Your circumstances and where you are, what God can be glorified.
All right, so God can be glorified in all things. And think about this too. God is not always the one who's the origins of your suffering. I think Job is a perfect example of that. God was not the origin of his sufferings. So all of that, and that's getting off way beyond what the scope of this lesson is this morning, but still yet, I think those are some of the questions. When we come into John chapter 9, we think so foolishly of these individuals to ask this question, but we find ourselves asking that same question in the 21st century. Well, why did Jesus, I'm sorry.
You might go back to Ezekiel 18:2, verse 20, that the Father doesn't bear the iniquity of the Son, and the Son the Father, the soul that sinneth it shall not. So they knew that. I mean, they knew that in the Old Testament. Sometimes sin does, the consequences of sin does bring suffering. You know, out of drunk, you go out and kill somebody as a result of that sin. Kill yourself. There are consequences of sin like that.
Absolutely. That's, again, going back to like John chapter 5, that seems to be the occasion in John 5. This man is in that predicament because of his sin, where this man is in this particular reason for the glory of God to be demonstrated. Well, why did Jesus heal the blind man? All right, so the glory of God might be demonstrated. What does Jesus specifically say here in the text that really indicates he's proving a point?
Doing the work that you sent to do.
All right, he's doing the work that he sent me to do. The light of the world. So in John 8 and verse 12, Jesus said what? I am the light of the world. How do you best demonstrate the power of light than do what? Giving light to one who has been in utter darkness for his entire life. The most powerful way to demonstrate Jesus' power and to manifest the authority that he has behind the statement. Jesus could easily say, I am the light of the world, and saying that I am the fulfillment of all of these things that's been happening this past week with the 4 candles. I am that. But he proves this even here in verse 5. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Come back with me to Isaiah chapter 42. And there's other passages in Isaiah that you could turn to that emphasize Jesus coming as the light of the world and the things that he was going to be doing. Isaiah 9 and verse 2, the people who walk in darkness will see a great light. Those who live in a dark land, the light will shine on them. That's talking about Jesus. But somebody in Isaiah 42, if somebody would read for us verses 6 and 7. The beginning of the servant songs. Who is Isaiah talking about that's going to be the light to the nations? Has to be Jesus. And then immediately after following that he's going to be a light to the nations, he's going to do what? He's going to open blind eyes. I think that John chapter 9 is the greatest fulfillment of this, because when Jesus heals the others that are blind, it seems like they're not as unique. But why is John chapter 9 unique? All right, he's never seen before, and the man himself says what? No one born blind has ever been healed. John 9, this man himself is a unique person in that. Well, Jesus, even in and I think that plays into that final question between the Pharisees and Jesus at the end of John chapter 9, place so much emphasis there. One of the All right, so there's so much that I want to talk about, and I don't want to get away from one of the questions. So how did Jesus perform this? What's unique about that? All right, he spits on the ground, makes the clay, applies it to the eyes, and tells him to do what? Go to the pool of Siloam and wash. Okay, I mean, how many different things does that remind you of? I mean, go to the pool and wash. Does that remind you of any other Old Testament story? Naaman, he doesn't go to the pool, but he goes to the Jordan and washes, and then when he dips himself, he comes up and he's cleansed. And so there's that imagery. Is this the only time Jesus ever used spittle? I'll tell you, how many of you want to sign up for that? Brother Greg is one of our elders, and his spit is got some magic behind it. And if you need to, he'll spit and he'll rub it on you. How many of you are going to volunteer for that? If it's going to be a result, you will. And that's the thing. So when you think about this, in Mark chapter 7 and Mark chapter 8, Jesus there uses, he touches the tongue, or he spits there, and even here he spits. And it's not that Jesus is doing anything miraculous in the saliva, but rather it's all about the heart of the faithfulness of the individual who's having this miracle completed. Yes. All right, so let's talk about this next question. What causes the man's faith to grow? All right, that did.
He was seeing how silly they are with their questions. He knew obviously what had happened. It just reinforced what he already believed.
I mean, at the end of the day, they could have their many excuses. When the man first comes back, what do the neighbors say? Is this the one, or is this possibly just someone who looks like him? Is this the same man, or is it possibly somebody else? So they had a right to deny. Even his parents say what? Well, yes, he is our son. Yes, he was born blind, but he is of age. They abandon their son. They deny him. The Pharisees are doing everything they can to conspire an argument against this miracle. Why are they arguing against the miracle? It was done on the Sabbath day. Now, remember in John chapter 7, why is Jesus not coming to Jerusalem in a public spectacle? Because the last time he was there in John chapter 5, they picked up stones to kill him because he performed a miracle on the Sabbath day. So that's another, uniqueness or likeness between John 5 and John 9. They're both done on the Sabbath day. They both are regarded or viewed differently. So he's abandoned by his parents. His neighbors deny him. The Pharisees deny him. But at the end of the day, what does he know? He knows that he's been healed by a man named Jesus. And then look at the progression of the man there. I know this has been talked about multiple times. Whenever you get into John 9, you definitely see it. Do you see the progression of the man's faith? Because when he was first asked, he said what? Well, when he's first asked in verse 11, the man who is called Jesus. The second time he's questioned, the prophet. But then at the very end of the chapter, when Jesus then comes back to him, well, who is he that I may honor him or praise him? And I love what Jesus says there in verse 37, you have both seen him. When had he seen Jesus? Through his eyes of faith. Because he had not seen him prior to the miracle because he was blind. And he's not seeing him until just now. But you have seen him. I think there's a special emphasis there that Jesus is saying, you've already seen me, but now I stand before you. Why is John chapter 9 written in that manner? Produces faith in us. How do we, have anybody seen Jesus? Absolutely. The purpose of the book, many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of these disciples, but these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ. The blind man is a representative of every Christian that lives today. We have not seen him, but we have through the eye of faith. I think that's something special about John chapter 9 too. All right, why did the blind man's family refuse to answer the question? All right, they're scared of the Jewish leaders because the Jews are going to do what? They're going to kick us out of the synagogue. But what does that matter? All right, they're Jews. All right, so it's where they go every Sabbath. What else is there? I mean, what's the problem with that? I mean, brethren, if you don't see a connection between being kicked out of the synagogue and withdrawal of fellowship, that you have to see there is a connection here. When they are kicked out of the synagogue, it's not just that they lose the place where they go on Sunday or Saturday. They lose all social interaction. It is a cutoff of what the parents, seem to deem more important than even their relationship with their son. But yet, when we get to the son, what is he willing to do? You can kick me out because I'm not going to bend to what it is that you want from me. All right. And they did. And when they kicked him out, who's there to, right there to receive him? All right, so this brings us to the final question of this section. How does Jesus use blindness to characterize the Pharisees? And if y'all remember, Matt tried to steal this thunder from us a couple weeks ago in his sermon. They're spiritually blind. They saw, but they didn't see. They saw, they had understanding, they knew the law. I mean, you think about what Jesus says to Nicodemus back in John chapter 3. Are you the teacher of Israel and not understand these things? That's essentially, Jesus is saying, you see all of these things, but you do not have ears that can hear. All right, so how could we find ourselves in the blindness of the Pharisees?
Often because there's a lot of dynamic here of those who reacted to Jesus who felt like they had something to lose. The parents felt like they had something to lose. The Pharisees certainly felt like they had something to lose, and we see that throughout the Gospels. But the blind man really didn't have a whole lot to lose, because in the dialogue in verse 8, this is not the one who sat in bed, but he probably felt like he didn't have a whole lot to lose. And so if we feel like we have something to lose in this life, then we can fall to the blindness of the Pharisees.
I immediately thought of, blessed is he who is poor in spirit, for he shall receive the kingdom of heaven. I have to be emptied of this world. I am spiritually bankrupt. I'm only gaining when I come to Jesus. I really appreciate that. What's another? What about in verse 24 and 29? What did the Pharisees know? Yeah, we know. We have to be careful of not being, we know, and then just shutting off everything else, right? We have to always be in search of the truth, always be in search of the knowledge of the truth, and be willing to listen. Now, I'm not saying that we have open minds to the point that our brains fall out, but I'm saying that we have to be careful even in that. All right, anything else there?
They asked, are we also blind? Jesus told us that if you were blind, you'd have no sin. In other words, you'd have an excuse if you were blind, but you say you see. So there is no excuse for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, immediately from this text, we move into John chapter 10, and Jesus using this as an opportunity to teach concerning himself being the good shepherd. So we're going to have a few questions there. The first is contrast the good shepherd with the hireling. Saving himself, right? Does that remind us of John chapter 9? Who's the Pharisees? The blind man's parents. They're hirelings, right? They only care about themselves, not about the one who they're supposed to be guarding. And when loss is too great for them, they run away. But here Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. I lay down my life for my sheep. Well, in a couple of these questions, we want to look at those. How is Jesus the door? What is Jesus saying there? All right, the only way to enter. Now, he's going to be even more specific in John 14 and verse 6 on that. No man comes to the Father except through me. But what's the imagery there? How many of y'all possibly, even in the material, I think you kind of talked about it very briefly. But what does it mean that Jesus is the door? Mm-hmm.
So in order for anything to get through, they had to go through him. So he protected them and secured the sheep, their peace. The writer talked about those things. That's my understanding of it. Right
about the door there, I mean, I'm not a shepherd. I don't know anything about sheep, but I do realize that based upon what I've read is that the first century shepherds, they would be out in the fields throughout the day with their sheep, but at nightfall, they're not going to let their sheep just be out in the fields, are they? What are they going to do at night? They're going to bring them into the sheepfold. Well, what's the sheepfold? Either the thorny bushes that were in a circular thing or a stone, and that sheepfold would be borrowed and used by multiple shepherds and multiple flocks. But once the sheep are put into the sheepfold, then the shepherd would, Brother Don, as you said, lay down in front of the door. So if I'm laying down in front of the door, what cannot get in without coming through me? A thief or a robber. So I am laying down my life, so Jesus is the door in that sense. Well, this next question kind of takes us back to chapter 9. How is Jesus the light? And we've talked about that a little bit, haven't we? We talked about that in John chapter 8, where the idea that, that great thematic that is used throughout the Bible, that darkness is representative of sinful and living contrary to the will of God, but then light is representative of that faithful type of living. So Jesus is that spiritual light that manifests our deeds and whether or not they are wrought in God. John chapter 3, verses 19 through 21. And the emphasis there. What else do you see with Jesus being the light? I really wish I'd have just put this earlier because that's where it should have been, but I didn't do that this time. Well, the next question, how is Jesus the good shepherd? Yes, go, John. Passages is John alluding to there? Ezekiel 34. Ezekiel 34. If you go back to Ezekiel 34, really the first 6 verses of Ezekiel 34, it is God's condemnation of Israel's elders and shepherds and what they were unwilling to do. You have sheep that are sick. You have sheep that are dying. You have this. This is what I expected of you. But what they did is they selfishly looked to themselves and only gratified themselves, and because of that, they neglected the sheep. But at the end of Ezekiel chapter 34, God promises that I'm going to send my servant David, who is going to be the good shepherd. And of course, that is Jesus. Jesus is the fulfillment of that, and Jesus is talking about that. Brother Frank. Absolutely. Well, and when you think about Jesus too, I always think about Matthew 9, verse 36 and 37. Jesus felt compassion upon the people because they were sheep without a shepherd. So how is Jesus the good shepherd? I heard something. All right, that's a comforting thought, isn't it? That He knows them, and when I call them by name, they do what? They listen and they follow me, brother.
No, I was thinking, how is Jesus the good shepherd? He is the good shepherd above all other shepherds. And that if one, he's the shepherd of the world,
you think about 1 Peter 5, is it verse 4 or verse 3, where Peter calls Jesus the chief shepherd? So he is the shepherd above all other shepherds. But what are some characteristics that Jesus gives to the good shepherd here in John chapter 10?
To be a good shepherd. And the hireling could care less, basically, like the sheep, in the long run. But Jesus has showed all along his primary care is for those. Not just superficial, but all those. And that's contrasting with the Pharisees. Because they're willing to turn on.
And you take that especially to verse 16. I have sheep of another fold. So Jesus isn't that it's that he cares only just for the Jews. Jesus cares for the Jews and the Gentiles. The main thing here is Jesus is the good shepherd because he lays down his life. But it's not just that he lays down his life, is it? Because look down to verse 18. He lays down his life, but he also will what? He will take it up again. So now we're looking at the death, burial, and resurrection. How is Jesus the good shepherd? Because through his death, burial, and resurrection, what does Jesus then make attainable for every one of us? Through God's grace, through faith. Salvation. So that I think all of this ties into what we're looking at. Well, when we think about this next question, find other ways that Jesus is described in the Bible and cite the Scripture. How long y'all want to spend? I think so. If your list is anything shorter than, what is it? Genesis 1:1 to Malachi 4 and verse 6, your list is too short.
Jesus said, what do you want? Those descriptions.
So the I am statements of Jesus throughout the Gospel, I think that's a perfect place to spend some time. I mean, it's endless to think of how Jesus is described. Isaiah 9 verses 6 and 7, eternal Father, mighty God, wonderful Counselor, a son will be, a son will be born unto you. There's so many descriptions of Jesus. And even there in John's Gospel, the emphasis is that when Jesus says, I am, he's not just making a statement that cannot be backed up. Those statements are, of course, validated by the miracles that he performs. All right, anything else on that question? Well, how do the masses view Jesus? All right, having a demon. Now remember, so when we're looking, we got to go all the way back to John 7 here for this. Because there really is three distinct individual groups of people that are here. There's the crowds who are representative of all of the Jews who have come to Jerusalem for the feast from all the various different portions of the land. Then you have the Jews, which is representative by the high council, the Sanhedrin, the leaders. And then you have the people from Jerusalem. So now one of the ways that Jesus is viewed, well, he has a demon. And that kind of runs throughout these chapters. What's another way that we see Jesus is viewed by the masses?
They didn't have the prestige that the Jews had. They listened to him because they followed him. He was very popular up to John 6.
While yet the majority leave in John 6, Jesus begins to draw the audience again. And what's going to lead to, ultimately, the conclusion of John chapter 11 is we've got to kill this man before this one man cost us the entire nation. Because the Pharisees, the Jews, the Sanhedrin, they're driven by jealousy. Jesus has notoriety, he has clout, he has an entourage that is greater than mine and ours. We've got to get rid of him.
Jesus Christ. The healed man viewed him as Messiah, the Messiah. Jewish leaders viewed him as better. And the people today view him as a good guy.
So when we look at all these various, so the masses, they saw something there. Because these are going to be the same masses that are going to come back to Jerusalem in 6 months. They're going to be the same masses that 6 months from this time, they're going to lay down their cloaks and they're going to the palm branches, and they're going to do what? Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now, do they have a firm understanding of everything that Jesus is going to do when he gets back to Jerusalem in 6 months? No. Because they're the same masses that's going to cry out, crucify him, crucify him. Now, of course, how did the healed man view Jesus? Lord, I believe. I think Thomas has a similar response. My Lord and my God.
He said, well, here's an amazing thing that you don't know where it's from. Yet he opened my eyes. Kingdom of God is not here sinners, but if anyone that is God-fearing, that is will he hears him. Since the beginning of time, it's never been heard of anyone open the eyes of the blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing.
We paid a little bit of attention about Jesus' origins in 7 and 8, did we not? It's here. It's running the gamut. It's throughout these chapters. The major thematic is, where is Jesus from? How do the Jewish leaders view him? Out of envy? Well, how do people view Jesus today? Brother Frank said they view him as a good person, a good man. How else does individuals view Jesus today? All right, a fraud. Why do we say that? All right. Why do they not believe? Why would they view Jesus as a fraud? All right, they haven't seen anything. All right, so the Word of God itself is just... It's a made-up book written by men, right?
Well, what book are you reading from? What's the truth? What's the real truth? And they all bicker back and forth. So what is the real truth?
Well, the factor of living in a postmodern age, we post-truth and everything such as that, all truth is subjective now. I mean, you get into conversations with even those who would proclaim to be religious or at least identify as some form of a Bible believer, but yet when you talk about the scriptures, they're going to say, well, that's your truth, but this is my truth. Brother Mann, you were going to say something?
They claim to know the law. Yet Isaiah 53 clearly this day we try to be the suffering Savior, save the world. And yet they don't listen to it all. Several other passages. Throughout, Christ Jesus went over this with his apostles.
Anything else?
Jewish leaders, real mixed views among them. They're divided. Some of them 17 along there that they divide themselves. I just think that stands out, you know. I don't know if it's 50-50 split, but apparently more of the Pharisees was not sure about this. You guys may be wrong. It may be everything.
So chapter. Now, one specific man that's definitely dealing with this, his name is Nicodemus. But we're also introduced to a second Sanhedrin councilman who was a secret disciple of Jesus. His name was Joseph of Arimathea. So we have both of these individuals that are in the Sanhedrin, in the high council. They're a part of the Jews, and they themselves are struggling to understand all of this. And I think, Brother Mann, going back to what you were saying, I think they knew the Old Testament, and because they knew the Old Testament, they were trying to understand how both the Christ would be the reigning king and the suffering servant. And their explanation of that, I mean, you could read it in their writings, their explanation of that is that it would actually be two. Some actually believe that there would be two Messiahs. One would come as a suffering servant, and the other one would come as a king. But they also saw kingdom only in the sense of what? Earthly. Davidic kingdom. That's what they saw, is a restoration of that. And of course, Jesus is not going to do that. Any other observations? Oh, Paul, you almost threw me for a loop there, Brother Foy. I was, whew, that Rolodex I was thumbing through it quickly Philippians 2, absolutely. Trained and was a Pharisee of all Pharisees. Any other observations?
Blind equals sin, right? That's what they were debating. But
Well, the whole thematics, and if anything else, I hope that you gained at least the past couple of weeks a better understanding of, these Gospels. Yes, they're written by the different individuals who wrote them, but they were written very specifically in for specific order. And that's one of the things, that's another reason I like the Gospel of John. I love this section of the Gospel of John. All right, anything else? Well, we don't continue in John 10 and verse 22 next week because that is 3 months later at the Feast of Dedication. This is going to be the final winter before Jesus is going to be crucified the following spring. But next week we go back to, I believe, Luke chapter 10, and we start going through the Gospel of Luke. Because Luke 10, you remember with me, we talked about this a long time ago. In Luke chapter 9 and verse 51, Jesus set his face toward Jerusalem. And that's really the momentum through the remainder of Luke's gospel, is Luke is going to emphasize Jesus' journey toward Jerusalem. From Luke 9 and verse 51 and onward, it is Jesus moving back to Jerusalem for that final Passover that's going to take us to the final week of his life. All right, any final comments, observations about our discussion this morning, or any other things? I appreciate it so much, and I hope that